On the back of a US dollar bill, there's an emblem of an eagle. In its talons, you have arrows, of course, a symbol of war, but on the other side, you have an olive branch, a symbol of peace.
That's not so different than this object that we're looking at that's nearly 4,500 years old, an object known as the Standard of Ur, which comes from the city-state of Ur, which is now in present-day Iraq.
In Mesopotamia, really the birthplace of civilization, and Ur is one of the great early cities. The word standard is a little misleading because a standard is really a flag that's often brought into battle. And the original excavator of this hypothesized that perhaps this was on a pole originally and was brought into battle. But in truth, we have no idea.
So often when we're in the museum and we're talking about ancient objects, we're talking about objects that had been buried, but buried just because of the passage of time. And here we're looking at objects that were intentionally buried. They were part of what seems to have been an elaborate burial ritual. These were excavated in the 20s and the early 30s by a man named Leonard Woolley, who discovered about 16 tombs that he called royal tombs.
Again, we really don't know, but what we do know is we see fabulously expensive objects.
And one of those valuable objects was the object we call today the Standard of Ur, which is small but quite beautiful and elaborately decorated.
Historians have thought that perhaps this is a sound box for a musical instrument. Others have thought it might have contained something important, perhaps even the currency that was used to pay for warfare. We simply don't know.
So that's one of the wonderful things about this object is that it tells us so much, and at the same time, it tells us so little.
So let's start off with just a simple description. So we have this object that is small enough so that it could easily be carried.
One long side seems to represent a scene of peace and prosperity.
It's divided into 3 registers, and it's framed with beautiful pieces of shell. Now, this is important because it really does show us the long-distance trade that this culture was involved with. You've got blue, lapis lazuli, that came from mines in Afghanistan. You have a red stone that would have come from India, and you've got the shells, which would have come from the Gulf just to the south of what is now Iraq. And it reminds us that these first great cities were possible because agriculture had been successful. In the river valley between the Tigris and the Euphrates, it was possible to grow a surplus of food that allowed for an organization of society where not everybody had to be in the fields all the time. Once there was enough food, some people could devote their lives to being rulers, and some to becoming artists or artisans.
And some to priests, right? You had a whole organization of society with different people performing different roles that was suddenly possible.
And you can see that organization represented in the 3 registers here. The most important, wealthiest, most powerful figures are towards the top, and then we have the common laborers down at the bottom.
And it's really typical in ancient Near Eastern art for us to see scenes divided into registers.
So let's start down at the bottom and move up. I see a human figure bearing a heavy bag.
And that's really what we have along the entire bottom register. Figures who seem to be bringing things to a destination. We see animals, figures carrying things across their shoulders or on their backs.
Just above that, you can see a number of people leading more clearly identifiable animals. You can see somebody herding along what looks like a sheep or a ram. You see a bull in front of that being led by 2 people, and then perhaps goats, perhaps sheep ahead of that, and another bull. These are people that might be bringing these animals to sacrifice. They might be bringing them as a kind of taxation. We really don't know, but people have hypothesized that this is showing a kind of collection, perhaps for the king, for the city. The register at the top clearly shows one figure that's more important than the rest. The king is larger, in fact so large that his head breaks into the pictorial frame.
And he also wears different clothing that helps to identify him.
He's seated on a chair that is interesting because it's got 3 straight legs and one leg that seems to be the leg of an animal.
Some of the objects that we see here are objects that were also found in the burials, but I don't think they found a chair that resembles that. That would be fun to see.
One of the objects that has been found, however, are the cups that so many of the figures here are holding. And so clearly these figures are are joining the king in some libation. They're drinking perhaps beer, perhaps wine, we're not sure.
There's some kind of celebration going on, some festivity or perhaps a religious ceremony.
It's worth noting that even the secondary figures here, that is, the figures who are seated but are not the king, are larger than the servants that surround them that are standing. And so even within the register, you have a hierarchy that shows the relative importance of three levels of society.
And then we have two figures at the far end who seem to be entertaining the seated figures who are drinking. One is playing a harp, and another figure on the far right perhaps singing.